horrific stories about haunted orphanages. Often when we talk about places inhabited by spirits, an abandoned palace in which a murder took place comes to mind, or a hospital in which blood is shed and sick people die, or it may be a place where practices of magic and the use of the jinn take place. But our story today tells a completely different thing, because it is stories about orphanages, that were inhabited by spirits and caused terror to those in them. So what is the reason that made such places turn into a house for souls that caused panic and horror to those in them? So follow with us these realistic stories presented to you side horror stories. The story of the frozen girl in the haunted orphanages. Everyone went on a tourist trip to one of the old buildings in the state of Michigan in the United States of America, and their tour guide began to explain the history of the old building that they were standing in front of, as the building was for an orphanage that contained 60 Indian children and girls, and they were not all orphans, but they were deposited in this house in order for them to integrate into the new society and acquire its culture. During the explanation, one of the visitors felt bored, and he was the author of this story and he was called Michael, so he decided to wander alone in the old building and chose one of the corners to stand and smoke a cigarette. And suddenly he felt very cold in the place and an unnatural movement behind him, so he found a little girl wearing flimsy clothes and looking Native American. Michael marveled at the presence of this little girl in an abandoned place. The child seemed to her to be feeling very cold, so he asked her about her name, but she did not answer, and here he decided to take off his coat until she felt warm, and when he took it off to give it to her he did not find her in the place. So he ran away and asked the guide if anyone lived in this place. He replied, "Of course not." So he told him what happened, so he smiled and said to him, "It seems that you have met the ghost of the frozen child," and tell him the full story that actually happened inside this place, because there was an orphan girl living in the orphanage, and one day she went out to play in the garden, but time stole her until the evening, so she ran away in order to enter to the home. But the nuns were cruel with the children. They prevented them from entering because they were late, and that was a punishment so that the children would not do the same. Indeed, the child remained outside all night in the middle of the cold weather, and when the sun rose, they found the child sleeping at the door with severe pneumonia, and after several days the child died, and the nuns did not stop this cruelty, but they hung her in the dining room in the home so that the other children were terrified and obeyed them. When the authorities learned what had happened, this house was closed and all the children were transferred to other homes. However, the spirit of the little girl roamed the building, and many others saw her. Vermont Shelter is one of the inhabited orphanages. This house was built in the 18th century, specifically in its late years, and it used to receive many orphans and children were receiving attention and care in it, but this did not last for long, as the management of the house was taken over by a tough-hearted man, and perhaps the reason for that is that he did not have children or that he lived a miserable life in his childhood, but what happened during his administration of this place was the most ugly. He was proficient in setting punishments for children, and because of this many of them died, but in the 44 year of the 19th century, children gathered on him and beat him with disobedience and then suffocated him. And since then the ghost of this director, and he was called Vermont, roamed at night between the corridors of the house and the rooms of orphans, and he always had a thin stick in his hand. Many stories have been reported by children that during sleep they were paralyzed, hindering their movement, and at this moment the ghost of Vermont appears to hit them with the stick, then ghosts of other children come running after him and then they beat him, and this was seen by everyone who visited the place and spent a night with the children orphans. The American government issued a decision to close this circuit, and then it became a shrine for any researcher who studies any mysterious phenomenon, but in the early 2000s, American society was surprised that the entire building was burning for no reason. Guthrie Orphanage. This house is one of the orphanages inhabited by ghosts, and the story begins when there were maintenance work in one of the ancient towers in the United States of America, specifically the state of Oklahoma, and during the work of the workers they were surprised that their equipment disappeared and appeared in another place. Of course at the beginning they thought this was just somebody kidding. But soon they discovered that it was not a joke, but because of the spirit of a girl who had lived in this tower for a while, and this girl was working as a nanny in an orphanage, but she committed suicide by hanging, after tying herself to a rope, and then jumped from the window of the house and got stuck in the air and died. And the strange thing is that residents of the tower see the rope with which the girl hanged herself from time to time. When the workers inquired about the relationship of the tower with this girl, it became clear that this tower was built in place of an orphanage, whose name was Guthrie, and it was demolished after the orphans were subjected to brutal treatment by a nanny who was working with him, and this girl killed 6 children and was not satisfied with killing but buried the bodies in the garden attached to the house. The girl was brought to court, but then she was unable to integrate into the society that rejected her brutality with children and what she did, so she killed herself.